Hello everyone and welcome back! Today's video is a continuation of a previous video where I used reference material gathered from Assassin's Creed Odyssey to 3D model these city tiles for DBA. If you'd like to watch that one, the link is in the card. If you would like to follow along with this video by painting up the exact same little city tiles for use in your game of choice, I've made the STL files available on Patreon. The link to that is in the description. They are free, so you don't have to give me anything. You can just go there and download the zip file that contains them, as well as a little text file that has the details of my 3D printer and how I printed them. With the introduction done, let's jump right into talking about 3D printing the models and what you'll want to do to tidy them up before actually painting them. I 3D printed these using an FDM 3D printer that's using plastic filament rather than using resin. If you used a resin printer, they would also turn out very good, I'm sure, though I have not tried it. There's one piece that may require support, and that's the Acropolis, because it's hollow underneath in order to fit over top of the other models and allow it to sort of settle in over top of the marketplace to be a part of your city if you so choose. The parts themselves turned out very well right off the bat for my Dremel 3D Idea Builder with a 0.2mm layer height, but there is a little bit of stringiness and there's some layering issues. I'm not going to bother sanding off the layers because we're going to cover a lot of it with texture, but I am going to snip away at the stringy bits, and I'm also going to be fixing up some of the trees that just snapped off when I was removing these from the build plate. I can be a little rough sometimes, so you know, there's damage that occurs, but it's very easy to fix with a PLA print. A little bit of super glue and things will stick together like a charm. So just putting the trees on using tweezers, and you can use some super glue activator if you want that to be particularly quick. If you have a small set of scissors, you can also go around and trim off these stringy bits to just clean up the surface even more. Those are going to catch paint and they're going to catch texture quite a lot, so at the very least you're going to want to trim the strings as much as possible. Or, you know, work them in and hang some little pennants from them and make them part of the decoration, I guess, if you want. To add some texture over top of things, which is much easier than actually sanding it, and will still cover up layer lines for the most part and make things look a lot better, I'm just going to be using baking soda, sand, and white glue. You could water down your white glue a little bit. I didn't really bother here. I think I've already got some water in this particular jar of white glue from previous projects, so it comes out thin enough for my purposes. I don't want it to be super thin because I want it to cover things up and give a little bit of a rough texture rather than having that FDM 3D printed texture on things. I'm using two different grits as well because I want there to be a bit of difference in texture across the model. You know, they're very small models, but you can do some stuff to differentiate areas anyway. So I'm using sand for the roads and for the trees in order to give a bit of a flocked texture to those trees. And then I'm going to be using baking soda in the dirt areas on the side, where I'm going to be flocking with grass anyway, so it's not going to be that visible, but on the shoulders of the road and stuff, you'll see a little bit of a difference in texture, and it's just kind of nice to have that. The reason I'm choosing to put sand on the trees rather than flock them is simply that A, I want the trees to stand out from the grass underneath. When a project is this small, you really want textural differences to make things stand out, as well as just color. And also because I want to keep them thin, and flocking is going to sort of bulk them out a little bit. I want them to look like that typical Mediterranean cypress tree, you know? So baking soda on the ground underneath the trees, sand on the trees, and sand on the roads to make the roads look coarse and rocky. And that'll give you a lot of difference and variation, and also cover up a lot of the layer lines where you might not want them. Afterwards, you can go in with some sort of wide, soft brush and just remove any extra texture from locations where you don't want it. Just be careful while you're doing this that you don't break things like the statue on the front part of the Acropolis or any of the trees, which, as we've already seen, can be a little fragile. After adding the texture, you may also find that some of the little stringies that you missed are more visible, so that's a perk. You can just go in and snip them as you're going. As usual, I recommend putting these models onto painting grips. I have a tutorial in the card now on how to make these homemade painting grips that are super simple, but will just help you hold the models at a little bit of a finger's distance, which makes it a lot easier when you're priming them or painting them to get around the edges of the base and get into sort of strange angles that you wouldn't otherwise be able to reach. Because these models are so small and they come with some protrusions, you may find it hard to press some of them down into blue tack for these painting grips. But if you use something like, as I'm using here, a file to just sort of press evenly around whatever obstacle there is, you'll find they can stick fine into the blue tack anyway, and you're not going to damage anything by using your fat fingers. The next thing I wanted to do is seal the project together so that sand and baking soda is very firmly attached and isn't going to be a problem with our primer. So first I'm going to use my airbrush, empty, no paint in it, and I'm just going to blow away the surface of these again to remove any excess sand or baking soda that I wasn't able to get with my soft brush. This isn't particularly necessary. The soft brush did a very good 90% job, but if you have an airbrush, this is a great way to just sort of make sure all the little flyers that you hadn't caught before are definitely gone. any grit, but baking soda in particular, if it remains loose underneath your primer, can cause things to flake up and crack and really do some bad stuff. So you do want to make sure that you've made the entire area as clear as possible before moving on to actually putting paint down. The next thing that I'm going to do to actually seal this, the sealing part of this step, is I'm going to use isopropyl alcohol and watered down white glue to seal in the remaining sand and baking soda, making it as solid as possible. The isopropyl alcohol, when sprayed over top, wets the whole surface so that when I drip on the watered down white glue using an eyedropper, it sort of dissipates itself among the wetted surface and spreads much more evenly than it would if I was just dropping big globs of this watered down white glue over top. What this means is the whole surface then gets a semi-even coating of this watered white glue that will solidify everything into really a sort of concrete-like surface. It's going to make this very, very strong, and you're going to be able to do whatever you want over top of it, and these models are going to last. The trees remain probably the most fragile part of these models, but they were a detail that I couldn't not add, and if I made them too much thicker, again, I would have lost that cypress tree effect. So there's some trade-offs here, but hopefully, if you do decide to follow along this project, you enjoy them as much as I do. Now you're going to want to prime them and paint them. I primed these using my airbrush, just with a black Vallejo surface primer, and then a zenithal highlight of white ink, as I normally do for my miniatures. This highlighted, once again, little stringy bits that I hadn't seen before, so I'm going to go in and snip those. For your own priming, if you don't have an airbrush, you can always use a rattle can, or you could apply it by brush. Vallejo surface primer kind of works for this, though you do want to watch out for bubbles being introduced by the brush when you put it on. For almost all of the painting here, I'm just going to be using cheap craft paints from my local store, Michael's. The brand is Artist's Loft if you live in North America. They are okay. They're a little globby. I'm actually going to make a video sometime in the future, someday, you know, fingers crossed, about what sort of situations you might want to use different types of paint for. But in this case, craft paint is very sufficient because it's terrain and I don't want to use expensive stuff on it. So just brown paint on all of the dirt areas where the grass and the trees are growing is how I'm going to start off here. And I'm going to apply the same thing to the sides of the Acropolis. The Acropolis in real life is sort of a stony surface. And we'll get there eventually, but I want to start with a dark brown because that's going to allow me to have some recessed shadows under the dry brushing we're going to apply later. There is an alternative approach though, because these miniatures are so small and they are done up with texture on the base here. If you don't want to apply flock, you can just paint the whole thing from the start as if you were painting on the texture. So in this case, this is green paint mixed with the brown paint we used earlier, still Artist's Loft, and I'm just throwing it on over the areas that I'm going to make grassy later anyway. By doing this, you can really actually get a pretty good texture. You can dry brush on some other stuff over top. You can sort of vary your hues here and there. You can put in some beige for sand. There's a lot you could do by just painting these, and it really depends on how you want your miniatures to look. For me, because my models, my actual Athenians and Spartans, are on flocked bases, I do want to have flocking on the grassy areas, just so everything sort of matches thematically and in terms of construction. But this is just an option that I wanted to suggest in case you hadn't thought about it. I'm also painting the exact same green and brown. It's almost a one-to-one mixture onto all of the trees, and that I am going to keep. As I mentioned earlier, I don't want to flock the trees because I think flock's going to bulk out the trees a little too much, and I want them to be slim and cypress tree shaped. So I'm going to paint the trees green and I'm going to keep them that way, but in this case I am going to go back over the green ground and paint it brown for my own purposes because I do want to actually flock all of these bases. Once you've gone through and done that, you can start working on the roads, which in this case are going to be with a light sandy brown to begin with. Starting always with the dark color, so starting a little darker than you might want. Or you might think, I guess, because we're going to build up lighter colors in layers as we paint this. So if you start with the darkest area, then that's your little shaded recessed areas, and then you just need to become more and more selective as you apply lighter colors one after the other. Apply them over narrower or smaller areas to pick out specific details. And this is sort of the fundamental, I guess, in miniature painting as well. You're working your shadows, mids, and lights, normally working up that way. Although if you use washes, you may be more used to going mids than shadows with a wash and then lights. But anyway, in this case, I'm going dark colors upwards. So to build up that sort of sandy, rocky texture on the side of the Acropolis, I'm now going in with, it's not quite a dry brushing technique, it's more like an overbrushing technique, which is to say, I've got the brush and I've got quite a lot of paint on it, and then I'm dabbing off most of it onto a paper towel, and then I'm just dragging the brush really quickly over the surface. It's not as quick as it looks because I am using fast motion on this footage, but it is pretty quick. Just sort of raking it up and down, and removing little bits of paint at a time. Then I'm just going back and I'm lightening the paint a little bit more, and then I'm coming in again and highlighting further. Doing this 2 or 3 times, lightening the paint each time is going to give you a nicer gradient. It's going to give you a smoother looking highlight than if you just went in with the lightest color from the start and you had this stark sort of black and white contrast. So going in, again, working to a mid-tone, then working to a light, dry brushing or overbrushing, depending on what you want to call it. The terminology, it's a hobby, so I'm not too hung up on the terminology necessarily. But dry brushing, then overbrushing, then whatever, into smaller and smaller areas on the roads as well. Sort of, I'm using the same technique and the same real paints for the dry brushing / overbrushing on the roads as I did on the sides of the Acropolis, except on the Acropolis, because I started on brown, it ends up looking more stark. Whereas here, because I started on a beige sandy color, it makes for more of a, just sand with sort of the light touching it from above. Going into the market here, just make sure you get between the tents a little bit and you sort of paint it along avenues where people would walk. It makes that area look a little more worn, a little more dusty. So it's a great way of indicating traffic around the tents. Because our tents aren't painted, don't be too bothered about overbrushing onto them. You're just sort of wasting paint, I guess. And you don't want to get too close to their bottoms, because leaving that shaded area around them implies a shadow from the tent, which is really nice. For the actual buildings, I went with a sort of yellowish brown to begin with. It's a bit of a weird, pukey looking color right now, but it is, once again, starting off at the darkest color. This is going to be the shade for a later, very light beige stucco color. So I wanted to start off dark so that I can come in light later and just pick things out. I don't want to use a wash on these because generally my experience with washes is pretty so-so. It's largely a good way to make a model that I've spent a lot of work on dirty, and then I have to clean it up again afterwards. And there are people who do wonderful things with them, and I think on miniature terrain like this, it could be a very quick way to bring out detail, except that if you printed this in FDM, there's layer lines everywhere. And if you put the wash on, it's largely going to pick out layer lines. And these models are too small for me to practicably sand all of the flat surfaces on, for example, the walls of buildings and stuff. So I'm just going to have layer lines, and the wash will pool in them, and either it'll just highlight the layer lines and make little lines, or if you have a slightly thicker wash, what it'll do is it will grip onto this texture, and in so doing, it'll sort of just gather in big droplets and make everything really, really dirty. Honestly, FDM 3D prints, be very, very careful if you do want to use washes on them. One area where the layer lines are actually working for us is the stairs on the front of the Acropolis here. As you can see, they sort of make a stepped pattern, so later on it's going to be very, very easy for me to pick out where I want to paint little steps on and give a little bit of texture to these stairs. If you are using a resin print, you're probably not going to have as pronounced layer lines, which might be an advantage in other places, for example if you want to use washes, but in this case, on the front of the steps here, where it kind of made a craggly texture, and on the top of the steps, where it actually looks like stairs, you might miss out on a little bit of a shortcut to texture. On small models like this, texture is kind of key if you want to make things look detailed, and you'll see that later on as we get into more of the detail when I start doing cobblestones on the top of the Acropolis here, and when I start doing the rooftops. These really sell the model, despite it being small and honestly not a very highly detailed 3D print. The texture that you can add by just painting on stuff like stippling is going to do an enormous amount to make these look really, really good. For the roofs, I start off here with a pretty wide brush. Again, everything here I'm using large-ish brushes because I'm just going in roughly for the dark colors, and I'm going to work my way to a more precise paint job as I work my way to the lighter colors, and I'm starting to apply highlights to more precise areas. And for the paint itself, this is a dark, dark brownish orange. Again, the darkest color of my roof tiles. Pardon me if I'm repeating myself, but there is a process to all this, and the more you have sort of a routine, the easier it's going to be to paint models, so hopefully that kind of routine helps you. After applying that, I'm going to go in with a smaller brush, and I'm going to put on dabs of a bright orange here. Now this is the place in the project where I'm not using a craft paint, I'm using a Vallejo Amaranth Red, and there's two reasons for this. Number one, I want it to be really, really vibrant, and in order for it to be really, really vibrant, you need to have a really good quality pigment, and mixing together the red and yellow craft paints just makes a sort of washed out orange. It is not bright and poppy. And I want this to be bright and poppy because the roofs are one of the real details of this whole project, so they need to look good. And number two, I need it to have the right texture and coverage for it to have this amount of sort of precision to apply to a small area without blobbing everywhere, and to sort of hold its color and cover other colors well. So it needs to be properly thick, but still kind of thin, and with a high amount of pigment. And I can't get that with a craft paint. So again, I'm going to try and make a video later on material choices, and I'm going to cover a little bit of the difference between craft paints and expensive paints. But suffice to say for now, as long as you're good at controlling the consistency of your paints, craft paints are usable in a lot of applications, and they're super great, especially for making the project sort of accessible and cheap. But in a few applications, you are going to want that more vibrant pigment, the higher concentration of pigment in a paint, or the better texture of a paint in order to get the right effect. And in this case, you know, I needed that for the roofs to look as detailed as they do. For the sides of the buildings, I'm using just a mix of white and yellow craft paint, going back to that because I'm using thicker, larger areas, and I'm trying to stick to texture and avoiding recessed areas, leaving those dark so that we get that sort of shaded look. I'm also just stippling it across the top of the Acropolis, much as I did the stippling on the roofs to give that roof tile look, and this is going to give me a sort of cobblestone look across the Acropolis. Using texture like this to really make things pop really helps with small models where sculpting the detail on, well, in my case with an FDM 3D printer, it was impractical to actually try sculpting on cobblestones. I had tried putting cobblestones, for example, on the road in my 3D models, and they did not come across at all in FDM at this layer height for this scale. So, painting on these sorts of details adds a lot of extra depth to the miniature that wasn't otherwise conveyed because of the materials used. Now, as for details on these miniatures, there's a couple of main ones that I would point out. First of all, and foremost perhaps, is all the little pavilions and tents all over the place. Awnings on the fronts of buildings and all the tents throughout the market. I'm going to be doing them in a combination of blue and red because these are pretty common dyes. They show up a lot in the screenshots I took of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is not a historical reference, I understand, but since I'm going for something stylistic and really interesting on the tabletop, I figure a video game where people put in a lot of work into designing things to look recognizable is not actually a really bad reference. And of course, my two armies that I use for DBA in this period are Athens and Sparta, which I have painted in blue and red colors respectively in order to help differentiate them on the tabletop, again, following from a sort of video game tradition of making identifiable faction colors, understanding that people didn't wear uniforms back then, etc. But by using blue and red here, I'm getting some striking primary coloration across the tents and the pavilions, and I'm getting to do a little bit of texture or sort of pattern work on top of the larger tents in the markets. So playing with this a little bit helps you get a lot of variety, and adding these colors is going to make these models pop on the tabletop quite a lot. I also do a couple of the pavilions here and there with a greenish brown color just to make them sort of look, maybe, you know, not everyone's rich enough to get some red and blue cloth, but you can mix things up as you wish. I'm also going to go in on the trees and just apply a little bit of a lighter green to the top and to sort of the faces that are exposed and not shaded by a nearby building or something, just to make the trees look a little poppier as well. They've got sand on them, so if you're dry brushing on stuff, you're going to get texture on them as well. Finally, for little details, I've got the fountains, and for the fountains, I'm just going to take some blue craft paint. I'm going to make a little plus on the top to imply water coming out the top and flowing down the sides, and then we're going to fill the reservoir of the fountain with more blue paint. And that's just going to make the fountain look like it's actually active and producing a little bit of water. And with these extra splashes of color and those roofs being a nice bright orange, hopefully these models are looking as good to you as they did to me by then. So we can move on to the flocking and finishing of the models. Now, flocking the models is going to do a lot as well to sort of draw out the color, make everything pop, because that vibrant green of flock contrasts very well with, for example, the red of the roofs and some of the tents. And that is, contrast is what draws the eye. So putting on some of this is 2mm flock from Woodland Scenics. I'm using a really, really small flock because I don't want it to obscure the buildings or make it look like they're sitting in wheat fields. And I'm just applying Mod Podge gloss. I'm using Mod Podge instead of just normal white glue for this, for the main reason that its texture is very easy to work with. White glue can be pretty gloopy and stringy and stuff. Mod Podge goes on very cleanly and only where I'm trying to put it. So it's very, very useful that way. Next, I'm putting on a little bit of brown paint around the edges, sorry about the focus there, just to clean everything up and make sure that everything looks kind of neat and tidy. I'm not going with my usual black because these are meant to be terrain, so I want them to blend into the board a little more, and I don't want that sort of diorama-esque outline around them necessarily. After applying a matte varnish to protect everything, the last step is to bronze up the statue on top of the Acropolis. This would be the statue of Athena in Athens, but there were many Acropolises across Greece, and this is just meant to be a sort of generic one. So, it'll be a statue of whoever you want it to be. I'm starting with bronze paint, and then I'm going in with gold paint. This is going to be as a highlight to the bronze. Adding some gold on the top of bronze paint can really make it sort of pop and shine a little bit more, make it look a little brighter. And I don't want it to be all flat gold because then there's no depth and it looks very yellowy. So the mixture of the two, in my opinion, is superior for making this sort of bronze, statuesque, large area painting look good. And you do want to apply this metallic paint after putting on a matte varnish, because if you put a matte varnish over something that's shiny, it becomes matte. And matte gold or bronze paint is really just an ugly yellow paint. With that done, you can move on to arranging the models on your tabletop, and I just wanted to do a little highlight here of how many different ways you can arrange them in terms of orientation, in terms of which tiles you put together, etc. They're built around a 4cm base width for DBA 3, and they allow you to make anything up to a 3x3 square area, or anything between little L shapes, single tile villages. The wider tiles can be a sort of long village along a highway. The big square one is obviously a marketplace or a good meeting place. The Acropolis can sit on top of the marketplace neatly, or it can sit next to things as just a terrain feature all of its own. And yeah, there's just a lot of options, so I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. This was honestly a super cool project to do. Turning something, from pixels to a real item was very fun, and seeing it painted is very fun. I hope this showed you how easy it is to take an idea from your mind and sort of project it through the computer into reality and really get into modeling the things that you want to see for wargaming. The availability of free software like Tinkercad or Blender, and the availability of 3D printing, either services on demand or 3D printers in your own home, has really done a lot for being able to sort of broaden what we have access to as wargamers. Being able to make my own terrain like this, and now to share it with you, is super, super exciting for me and really opens a lot of doors in the hobby sort of world. If you do want to have access to these models and make them for yourself, as I mentioned earlier, they are on my Patreon. The link to Patreon is in the description. The models themselves are free. You don't have to pay me anything. Just if you'd like to have access to them, you can have access to them. But it was just a convenient way for me to share them with other people while also, drawing a little bit of attention to Patreon in case that interests you. With a baby in the house, I'm sorry I haven't been able to do a more regular upload schedule. I'm going to be trying to get back to that maybe someday. But for now, I've got some other projects on the table. For example, probably the next one you'll see on YouTube is I'm taking plastic Battletech models, the sort from the new Kickstarter, and I'm sort of modifying them to bring them more in line with what I did with my metal Battletech models in the Clan Wolf video I put out a little while ago. I've also, I'm hoping to make a video on my materials, which I discussed a little bit during this video in terms of, material choice and what items I recommend for beginners and that kind of stuff. And I've also got some other stuff down the pipe, hopefully a little more historical stuff again. So anyway, whenever that stuff comes out, hopefully you enjoy it. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. If you got any questions, comments, or concerns about what happened in this video, please leave them down in the comments. I do read them. And until next time, go play some games.